All right, both of you, IDs, right now.
What's the reason?
You're in an area with break-ins. I need to know who you are.
Just standing here is not suspicious. What specific facts made you stop us?
You two look like you're scouting, like you're casing places.
That's not a fact, that's a guess.
Start me a second unit, possible drug activity.
The Mesa officer thought he was stopping just another black couple he could pressure, confuse, and send on their way with no questions asked. He had no idea he was already talking himself into a record, into radio traffic he couldn't clean up later, and into a stop that another officer was about to examine line by line. What he tried to sell as a routine contact was already turning into the kind of encounter that exposes exactly how bad stops happen in the first place. Before this goes further, drop where you're watching from in the comments. And if you follow stories about accountability, bad stops, and people who know how to hold their ground without losing control, hit like and subscribe. This started in Mesa, Arizona, in a quiet commercial area that didn't give the officer much to work with. Parked cars, storefronts, low traffic, no crowd, no active disturbance. Edward Ellison and Tiana Ellison were standing there like countless other people stand near businesses every day, talking and minding their own business. Nothing dramatic. That's what made what happened next so telling. The officer rolled up and skipped right past normal contact. He didn't come in like someone checking on a situation. He came in like he'd already decided what they were. His first move was control, identification, questions framed like commands. Then the real tell came out fast. He started implying that they didn't fit the area, not directly at first. Officers who do this a lot usually don't say the ugliest part immediately. They circle it. They let the suspicion hang in the air and act like everyone is supposed to understand what they mean without them having to say it clean. Edward and Tiana caught it right away. They didn't match his energy. That mattered. A lot of people think the turning point in these encounters comes when voices rise. Sometimes it does. Here it came because the couple refused to help him build the stop for himself. They stayed calm and made him do the work. Edward asked what legal basis he had for stopping them. Tiana asked whether they were actually being detained. Very simple questions. The kind that sound almost too basic until an officer can't answer them. And he couldn't. Instead of naming a crime, he drifted into theory. He suggested they might be scouting homes or businesses. That was the first invented layer. Not based on a report. Not based on observed tools, forced entry, masks, lookout behavior, or anything real. Just a theory built around presence. Two black people standing in a place where, in his view, they needed to explain themselves. That was the engine under the whole thing. Tiana quietly started recording audio. That decision changed everything, even though the officer didn't know it yet. That's how a lot of these encounters work. The person trying to control the scene thinks the moment belongs to him because he has the badge, the radio, the uniform, the official posture. But the record starts moving in another direction, a phone in a hand, audio running, timestamps, tone, word choice. What was asked? What was dodged? What got added later? Once that exists, the story doesn't belong only to the officer anymore. Edward kept pressing the same point. Not arguing all over the place, not taking the bait, just bringing it back. What crime was being investigated? Were they free to leave? What facts created suspicion? The officer still wouldn't answer straight. He pushed harder instead. That's another bad sign. When an officer has lawful grounds, he usually states them. When he doesn't, he often tries to replace legal clarity with pressure. Then he called for backup, and he made it worse. Over the radio, he added possible drug activity. Just dropped it into the encounter like he needed a heavier label to justify the direction this was going. No drug scene, no suspicious items, no exchange, no odor described, no paraphernalia, no actual criminal conduct. Nothing in the situation as described supported that leap. He just needed something uglier, something that would make the stop sound more defensible once other units started listening. That's the part officers sometimes forget. Radio traffic isn't just theater for the moment. It's evidence later. Once a false narrative enters the log, it can either be supported or it can collapse. There isn't much room in between. Edward and Tiana heard the shift. So did anyone who would have reviewed the dispatch trail later. The stop had now moved from vague suspicion to active narrative building. Same encounter, same empty facts, bigger accusation. The officer kept trying to make them play the role he'd assigned them. He wanted nervousness. He wanted overreaction. He wanted one bad sentence, one angry move, one excuse to say his instincts had been right all along. He didn't get it. Tiana stayed steady. Edward stayed direct. They didn't help him fix the holes in his own stop. That's what made the scene more dangerous for him, even if he didn't realize it yet. Because once a stop like this fails to produce facts, the officer has two choices: end it or double down. He doubled down. By then, the whole contact had become something bigger than one patrol officer talking too much in a parking area. It was turning into a test of who could actually carry the burden of truth once more the people got involved. The first officer was betting on the usual outcome. Backup arrives, uniforms align. The original version gets protected. The civilians get outnumbered and worn down. That bet was about to fail. The next officer coming in wasn't walking into a clean scene. He was walking into a stop built on shifting claims, unanswered legal questions, and a drug reference that didn't match any visible fact. And Edward and Tiana weren't standing there, confused about what was happening. They were tracking every piece of it, calmly, precisely. The first officer still thought he had time to shape the story. He didn't, because the second officer, Daniel Reeves, was about to ask the exact kind of simple professional questions that bad stops never survive. Officer Daniel Reeves arrived expecting the usual thing: a patrol officer making contact, a couple of civilians, some explanation that would sound thin but usable. That's probably what the first officer expected too. He'd already laid the groundwork over the radio. Possible casing, possible drug activity. Enough loaded language to make the stop sound more serious than it was. But Reeves didn't just absorb the first version and move on. He started asking basic questions, the kind that should have been answered immediately if the stop had any real foundation. What exactly had been observed? What crime was being investigated? Who had reported it? What specific facts led to the drug reference? Had either of them been seen handling narcotics, exchanging items, hiding contraband, trying to flee, or doing anything that pointed to an actual offense? The first officer had no clean answer. He kept circling back to impressions, presence, vibes, the area, how they looked standing there, how long they'd been there. It was weak, worse than weak. It sounded like a man trying to reverse engineer reasonable suspicion after he'd already made the stop. And Reeves could see it. That changed the whole energy of the scene. Not loudly, not dramatically. This wasn't one officer openly dressing another one down in front of civilians. It was subtler than that, more damaging too. Reeves kept it professional. He asked short questions. He stuck to facts. He didn't rescue the first officer by adding his own assumptions. That alone started stripping the stop down to what it really was. Edward and Tiana noticed it right away. They could tell Reeves wasn't eager to rubber stamp what had already happened. He wasn't hostile toward them. He wasn't performing solidarity for the first officer. He was looking for something objective he could write down and defend later. He wasn't finding it. The first officer felt the shift, too. And this is where officers like that often get themselves in deeper trouble. Instead of backing out cleanly, he started trying to soften his earlier language without fully letting it go. He hinted that it was just a field interview, just a routine check, just making contact in an area where businesses and homes mattered, just trying to be proactive. That might have worked if he hadn't already gone further, but he had. He'd already implied they didn't belong there. He'd already floated the theory that they were scouting locations for crime. He'd already injected drugs into the radio traffic. Once an officer does that, he can't casually rewind the encounter and pretend it was community policing. Reeves kept asking, had there been a complainant? No clear answer. Had either person admitted to anything? No. Had the first officer seen contraband? No. Had they tried to leave after being told they were detained for a specific crime? That question hung there, because the first officer still hadn't clearly established any lawful detention in the first place. That's the part that usually gets buried in stories like this. People talk about attitude, tone, respect, officer safety, all the vague language that lets bad stops breathe. But the real center of it is simple. What specific articulable facts existed? At the moment the officer decided these two people weren't just citizens standing in public, but potential criminals who needed to identify themselves and justify being there. Reeves was effectively forcing that question into the open, and there still wasn't a real answer. Edward stayed locked in. He didn't start grandstanding just because another officer seemed more professional. He kept it narrow. Legal basis. Facts. Detained or not detained. He wasn't trying to win the street argument. He was making sure nobody could later pretend this had been some chaotic misunderstanding. Tiana did the same. Calm, focused. Recording, still running. Then the stop broke open. Edward and Tiana presented federal credentials. Not in some flashy way, not as a threat. They didn't suddenly become louder or smug. They just produced identification that changed what the first officer thought he was dealing with. Tiana's credentials tied her to civil rights work. And in that moment, the first officer understood something ugly all at once. This wasn't going to stay trapped inside his version of events. These weren't two people he could intimidate, delay, or confuse until they gave up and left. They knew exactly what mattered. Records mattered. Language mattered. Sequence mattered. Every claim he'd made was now a potential exhibit. His tone changed immediately. That's always revealing. Not because authority should only be respected when a person has status. That's the whole problem. He hadn't treated them like ordinary people entitled to ordinary rights. He'd treated them like convenient suspects until he saw credentials he associated with consequence. Then suddenly he sounded measured, more polite, more casual, more interested in wrapping things up without friction. Too late. Reeves had already seen enough. The recording already existed. The radio traffic already existed. And Edward and Tiana had just shown that they were not only calm under pressure, but fully prepared to follow the paper trail after the stop ended. The first officer started trying to repackage the contact. He suggested it was all routine. Standard. No big deal. Just checking. Just making sure everything was okay. But that version couldn't survive the timeline. Routine contacts don't usually start with demands unsupported by clear facts. They don't usually involve telling people they don't fit the area. They don't usually develop into unsupported theories about casing property. And they definitely don't suddenly add drug suspicion over the radio for no factual reason. The whole thing was now sitting in plain view. A bad stop. A changing story. A backup officer who wouldn't decorate it with fake certainty. That's when command had to enter the scene. Because once an encounter starts unraveling in front of multiple officers, somebody higher usually gets called to contain the damage. A sergeant arrived. By then, the first officer had lost the core battle. Not the ego battle, the factual one. The sergeant wasn't arriving to a blank slate. He was arriving to a stop where another officer had already been asking why the legal basis didn't make sense, where the couple remained composed, and where the original officer's own radio language was now part of the problem. Tiana didn't waste time. She formally stated that she had a full audio recording of the encounter. Then she laid out exactly what would happen next. Body camera footage would be requested. CAD records would be requested. Dispatch logs would be requested. There would be an internal complaint and a full investigation into the detention. That was the moment the stop fully flipped. Not because anyone raised their voice, not because the first officer got publicly humiliated in some dramatic movie scene way. It flipped because the tools of accountability were now on the table in a specific, informed, unavoidable way. Recording, logs, video, supervisor awareness, a witness officer who had already made clear there was no solid basis for what happened. And Reeves didn't blur it to protect the stop. He confirmed in substance that there was no valid basis for detention. That's a brutal thing for a bad stop. Once that gets acknowledged on scene by another officer, the original version starts dying before the report is even written. The sergeant had very little room left. He couldn't credibly turn the couple into the problem. They were calm, consistent, precise. He couldn't sell the stop as some fast-moving uncertainty. There was no real offense driving it, just an officer who saw a black couple in a quiet area and started building suspicion around their existence. So the pressure changed direction. Not openly, but it changed. The question was no longer what Edward and Tiana were doing there. The question was what the first officer thought he was doing. The sergeant understood the problem fast. Not because the first officer explained it well. He didn't. The sergeant understood it because the stop had already been stripped down to its weak parts before he got there. No clear reported crime, no specific observed conduct, no real explanation for why drug activity had suddenly gone over the radio. And now a full audio recording sitting in Tiana's possession. That changes the scene fast. The first officer still tried to shrink what happened. He pushed the safer version now. He acted like it had been a basic contact that got misunderstood. He tried to flatten the escalation and make the whole thing sound administrative. That wasn't going to hold. Not with Reeves there. Not with the couple staying consistent. Not with the sequence already laid out in real time. Tiana made it plain that they weren't interested in arguing on the sidewalk. They were interested in records. She stated that they would be requesting the body camera footage, the CAD entries, the dispatch audio, the unit history, and the incident documentation tied to the stop. She also made clear that her audio recording captured the officer's shifting reasoning from the beginning. That's when the first officer really lost control of the encounter. He couldn't fix the timeline anymore. He couldn't smooth over what he said first by changing his tone at the end. Edward stayed the same way he'd been the whole time. Calm, focused, no speech, no performance. He kept it on one issue. There had been no lawful basis to turn them into suspects. That was the point. Everything else was cleanup. Reeves didn't retreat from what he'd already made clear. He confirmed in front of the sergeant that there was no valid basis for detention based on what had been personally observed. That mattered more than people realize. Internal cases often turn on whether someone inside the system is willing to say the obvious before the paperwork gets massaged. Reeves did. He didn't make a scene. He didn't need to. He just didn't help bury it. At that point, the sergeant did the only thing left to do. He ended the stop. Edward and Tiana were released. No citation, no warning, no contraband, no criminal referral, no supporting facts for the drug claim. Nothing. The entire encounter had started with suspicion and ended with emptiness. That's usually the clearest sign that the suspicion was never real in the first place. And that's where some people think the story ends. Couple gets released, bad stop over, everybody goes home. Not this time. Because the real damage for the first officer started after the scene was quiet again. Edward and Tiana followed through. They didn't let the encounter turn into one of those stories people tell privately and never document. They moved fast. Records requests went in. The audio was preserved. Notes were made while every detail was still fresh. Times, sequence, exact shifts in language. The point where the officer suggested they didn't fit the area. The point where he floated the casing theory. The point where drug activity suddenly appeared with no factual basis. The point where Reeves started asking the questions the first officer couldn't answer. The point where the tone changed after credentials came out. Every important move had a place on the timeline. That made it dangerous for the department to dismiss. Internal investigators had a simple problem in front of them. If the officer's version was legitimate, the evidence should support it. The body camera should show objective facts. The CAD notes should line up with the stated basis for the stop. The dispatch traffic should reflect actual observations. The secondary officer's account should reinforce the original decision. That's what would have saved him. It didn't. The review started focusing on the gap between what he claimed and what he actually had. Investigators looked at the stop itself, then started widening the lens. Prior contacts, radio traffic patterns, similar incidents. Other times he escalated vague encounters into criminal suspicion without clear legal grounds. That kind of review is where trouble gets real, because one bad stop can be explained away by people who want to protect the badge. A pattern is harder to hide. And the patterns started to matter. Supervisors had to ask why this officer kept turning thin observations into heavier accusations. Why ordinary presence kept becoming detention pressure. Why unsupported criminal theories kept showing up in his field contacts. Why the language in his stops seemed to grow more serious whenever he needed cover for an encounter that began with almost nothing. He got pulled from street duty while the investigation moved forward. That wasn't the final consequence, but it was the first public sign that the department understood this couldn't just be brushed aside as a misunderstanding. Street duty is trust. Once that trust gets questioned inside the department, everything tightens around the officer. Reports get read differently. Old contacts get revisited. Supervisors stop assuming judgment and start checking it. The case also spread beyond internal channels. What happened to Edward and Tiana got discussed the way these incidents usually do when they hit a nerve. First among people who already knew how these stops happen. Then among people who had their own stories. Same structure, same tactics. Officer sees someone and decides they don't belong, pressures them for identification, invents a theory, then goes fishing for something bigger when challenged. People recognize the pattern because they'd lived versions of it. The only difference here was that this one had cleaner evidence than most. That's why the recording mattered so much. Without it, the first officer could have leaned on the usual defense. He could have said the couple seemed evasive. He could have said there were indicators that didn't fully translate into a report. He could have claimed his radio language got misunderstood in a fluid situation. He could have hidden behind officer safety and proactive policing and all the other catchphrases that make bad stops harder to challenge. The recording boxed him in. Reeves boxed him in too. That combination was brutal. One record from outside the department, one witness from inside it. Same basic conclusion. The suspicion didn't come from facts. The facts were being invented to support the suspicion. That's the heart of the story. The officer didn't lose because Edward and Tiana had status. He didn't lose because they produced federal credentials. He'd already lost before that, really. He lost because he tried to build a criminal narrative around a black couple doing nothing wrong. And that narrative got preserved before he could rewrite it. The credentials just made him realize too late that the people in front of him knew exactly how to force the system to answer for it. And that part matters. A lot. Because rights aren't supposed to depend on whether the person stopped knows civil rights procedure, knows records law, knows how dispatch logs work, or has a second officer willing to tell the truth. Ordinary people deserve lawful treatment too. The story hits hard because it shows how often accountability still depends on preparation, documentation, and somebody refusing to play along with a false frame. Edward and Tiana didn't win by outshouting him. They didn't win by getting emotional and trying to beat a badge with volume. They won by staying locked on facts. by not letting the officer turn the encounter into a personality contest, by recording, by asking the same legal questions he didn't want to answer, by understanding that oversight starts the second someone decides to preserve the truth instead of trusting the system to do it for them. That's why the stop fell apart. Not because the officer had a sudden change of heart. He changed tone only when he saw possible consequences. That's an important detail, and people shouldn't look away from it. He treated them one way when he thought they were easy targets. He treated them another way when he thought they had institutional power behind them. That switch told the whole story on its own. In the end, the officer tried to turn an ordinary moment into criminal suspicion. He tried to make presence sound like planning. He tried to make a weak stop sound serious by adding drugs to the radio. He tried to lean on the usual assumption that once police language enters the record first, it controls the story. He was wrong. The record beat him. The questions beat him. The facts beat him. And that's the lesson here. When somebody in authority starts building a case out of nothing, the smartest response isn't panic, it's precision. Know what was said. Know what was observed. Know what changed. Know what can be requested later. Once the false narrative gets checked against the actual sequence, a lot of power disappears fast. So that's the story. A Mesa patrol officer thought he had found just another couple he could pressure without consequence. What he actually found was a clean record, a professional witness, and two people who understood that accountability starts before the stop is even over. What would you have done in that situation? Have you ever seen an officer try to create suspicion first and look for facts later? Put your thoughts in the comments. Share the story with somebody who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories like this.
Where'd you get that uniform? You got proof you're supposed to be wearing it?
Deputy, I'm on official travel. What's the legal reason for this contact?
Don't flip it on me. I asked you a question. Who are you?
Colonel David Holloway. This is a government vehicle. If you have a lawful basis, state it.
You're not going to tell me how to do my job. Show me your ID. Are you detaining me? Yes or no?
This deputy thought he was pressing just another man at a gas pump with a few aggressive questions. But he had no idea he was actually confronting a real high-ranking military commander on official travel. He looked at the uniform, decided it didn't belong on that black man, and acted like suspicion was enough to turn a fuel stop into an interrogation. Watch how that bad decision started falling apart the second the commander stayed calm, stayed precise, and made the deputy explain himself. This wasn't just an awkward encounter. It was a clean, recorded example of reckless authority running straight into discipline. Before this goes any further, say where you're watching from. Country, state, city, wherever. And if you like stories where arrogant people overplay their hand and get exposed by their own behavior, hit like and subscribe. Now look at the scene the way it actually unfolded. Deputy Ryan Mercer pulled into that county line gas station late in the evening, thinking he was about to do something proactive. That's how guys like him usually framed it. Not interfering, not guessing, proactive. He spotted a government SUV at a pump under the canopy lights. Next to it stood Colonel David Holloway, a black man in full military command uniform, fueling up on the way between installations. That should have been the entire story. Government vehicle, military uniform, quiet stop for gas. Move on. Mercer didn't move on. He got out, locked onto Holloway almost immediately, and walked straight toward him with the kind of energy that told everyone nearby this wasn't a greeting. He didn't start normal. He didn't introduce himself in any professional way that matched the situation. He went right at the uniform. He wanted to know why Holloway was wearing it, where he got it, whether he was actually military, whether he had proof he had the right to wear it. That right there told the whole story honestly. Mercer wasn't reacting to a crime. He was reacting to what he thought looked out of place, and Holloway caught that instantly. Holloway didn't flinch, didn't match Mercer's tone, didn't start explaining himself like he owed a stranger a life summary at pump number 4. He answered respectfully. Short, controlled. He made it clear he was on official travel, and then asked the question Mercer clearly didn't want asked back. What legal basis did he have for detaining or questioning him while he was fueling a government vehicle? That was the first moment Mercer had a chance to reset. He could have backed up, realized he'd gone in too hot, and corrected himself. A professional officer would have done exactly that. He didn't. He took Holloway's composure personally. Bad officers do that all the time. They hear a calm legal question and treat it like disrespect because they were expecting nervousness, apology, or submission. Mercer had already decided he was in control of the whole interaction. When Holloway didn't play small for him, Mercer got sharper. He kept pressing the same point. Uniform, identity, proof. He acted like the mere possibility that someone could impersonate military personnel gave him the right to turn his own assumption into a field investigation with no clear basis. That's where ego started driving the stop. Not law, not facts. Ego. Holloway stayed where he was, posture straight, voice even, movements minimal. The more Mercer poked at him, the more obvious the contrast became. One man looked trained. The other looked irritated the training wasn't working on him. A truck driver fueling 2 pumps over started watching. So did a woman by a compact sedan near the store side. Inside, the cashier kept glancing up through the glass because Mercer's body language was getting louder even before his voice did. People know what routine police contact looks like. This didn't look routine. This looked personal. And it had started fast. About 10 minutes earlier, Holloway had taken the exit because he still had miles to cover and the fuel gauge had dropped lower than he liked. He was traveling in a marked government vehicle on a standard movement between installations. Nothing unusual there. No speeding, no traffic stop, no suspicious call attached to the plate. He'd pulled in, parked cleanly by the diesel-capable pump, stepped out in uniform and started fueling. That should matter. It mattered later, at least. Mercer had entered the lot from the far side and seen the scene in pieces before he saw it as a whole. Government vehicle, black man in command uniform, quiet gas station. For most people, that adds up to nothing. For Mercer, it triggered some ugly mix of suspicion and entitlement. He didn't think through what he was seeing. He reacted to it. He treated Holloway's presence in that uniform like it needed to be justified to him first. That was the original sin of the whole encounter. Not caution, not investigation, assumption. Mercer shifted position and started moving around the SUV, looking it over like he was waiting for something to validate what he already believed. Holloway noticed it. Witnesses noticed it. Mercer wasn't gathering facts in any orderly way. He was fishing. He wanted the vehicle to look wrong. He wanted the answers to sound wrong. He wanted the scene to become the story he'd already written in his head. Holloway didn't help him write it. He kept bringing Mercer back to the same issue. Was he being detained? If so, for what reason? If not, why was Mercer demanding identification in that tone over a lawful uniform in a government vehicle? Clean questions, tight questions. The kind that sound even stronger when the other person can't answer them directly. Mercer didn't have good answers, so he started replacing answers with force of presence. He stepped closer. He repeated demands. He leaned harder on the idea that the uniform itself might be fake. He made it sound like Holloway had created the problem by not immediately handing over whatever Mercer wanted. And that's another thing officers like Mercer do. They create the conflict, then blame the target for not making it easier. By then, the woman at the next pump had her phone angled low. Not dramatically, just enough. The truck driver had stopped pretending not to listen. The cashier had already guessed this was heading somewhere bad, because Mercer's posture had gone from questioning to challenging. Holloway still hadn't raised his voice. That made Mercer look worse every second. Then Mercer made the move that really buried him later. He got on the radio and called for backup. Not because Holloway had threatened him. Not because Holloway reached for anything. not because there was any visible crime. He called because Holloway's calm wasn't giving him the result he wanted, and he needed other deputies to arrive and validate the pressure he'd started. Worse than that, he framed the situation in a way that suggested he might be dealing with someone impersonating military personnel. That wording mattered a lot. Dispatch recorded every word. Bodycam kept rolling. Witness phones kept catching pieces of the tone and timing. Mercer was building a record against himself and didn't know it yet. And Holloway knew exactly what kind of officer he was dealing with now. Not the cautious kind, not the competent kind, the insecure kind, the kind who confused being challenged with being undermined, the kind who thought authority meant nobody should ever ask him to justify what he was doing. That's where this stopped being a bad interaction and started becoming a career-ending one. Because once backup started moving, verification would start moving too. And Mercer had just escalated a no-issue fuel stop into an official suspicion call against the wrong man. Really the worst possible man. Mercer kept the pressure on after the backup call. He stayed focused on the uniform and acted like that alone justified everything he was doing. He wanted identification. He wanted proof. He wanted Holloway to explain himself in a way that made Mercer feel in control again. That was the real problem now. The stop had stopped being about facts. Mercer was trying to force the scene to match the suspicion he started with. Holloway didn't help him do that. He answered in a controlled way and brought the issue back to the same point. He was standing beside a government vehicle, fueling it during official travel, and Mercer had walked up treating him like a criminal without explaining any legal reason. That was the issue, not Mercer's gut feeling, not Mercer's personal disbelief, the actual reason for the stop. Mercer had no good answer, so he shifted into inspection mode. He moved around the SUV and looked at the plates, the markings, the windows, the rear quarter panels like he was trying to spot something that would save him. He checked the vehicle because the uniform challenge wasn't landing the way he expected. Then he went back to the uniform again. Same angle, same suspicion. He was bouncing between the man and the vehicle because he still wanted one of them to give him a clean excuse. Nothing did. The SUV was clearly government issued. The uniform was in order. Holloway's appearance, posture, and responses all matched someone who knew exactly what he was doing and exactly how not to get dragged into a pointless roadside argument. That contrast started catching attention. The truck driver parked 2 pumps over, stayed where he was, and watched. A woman near the storefront side of the lot slowed down instead of leaving. Inside the station, the cashier kept looking up because Mercer wasn't handling this like a brief check. He was dragging it out. People could see that. They didn't need legal training to see it. One man was standing there, fueling a vehicle and answering in a controlled way. The deputy was the one turning it into a scene. Mercer asked for identification again, harder this time. Holloway didn't give him a performance. He didn't start trying to impress him. He pressed Mercer on the actual reason for the detention and whether Mercer was giving a lawful order or just making demands because he didn't like what he was seeing. That put Mercer in a bad spot. He wanted compliance without having to explain himself first. And that's where his tone started slipping. He got sharper, less professional, more personal. He treated Holloway's calm response like a challenge to his authority. That part mattered later because Bodycam doesn't just capture words. It captures pace, tone, distance, and how fast an officer gets irritated when somebody refuses to play the role he assigned them. Dispatch started checking the vehicle. That should have helped Mercer back out. It didn't. The registration came back consistent with a government-owned vehicle. That was a big fact, not a minor detail. A real deputy looking at the situation honestly would have understood right there that he was standing on weak ground. Mercer didn't step back. He adjusted the story in his own head and kept going. Now he acted like maybe the vehicle was real, but the man standing beside it wasn't. That was the point where his judgment fully broke down. He started picking at the rank and presentation of the uniform, as if he had some solid basis for doubting it. He didn't. He was just talking, filling space, trying to keep control of an encounter that was already turning against him. Holloway let him keep talking because Mercer was making the later review easier with every extra minute. Then Mercer used the radio again. He updated the situation in a way that still leaned into the impersonation idea, even though the facts were already moving the other way. That was a serious mistake. He wasn't just being rude in public anymore. He was pushing a misleading version of events into an official record. Witnesses noticed the same thing supervisors would later notice. Mercer had started with suspicion and never honestly tested it. He just kept feeding it. The woman at the next pump had her phone up now. The truck driver was listening openly. The cashier would later remember Mercer circling back to the same accusation instead of explaining why he had started the stop at all. That mattered because Mercer was going to need ambiguity later, and there wasn't much left. Then dispatch came back with more. This time it wasn't just the vehicle, the identity and travel status connected through official channels. Holloway was exactly who he appeared to be: legitimate military commander, official travel, no active issue, no basis for an impersonation theory. That was the turning point. Mercer had spent several minutes treating a lawful uniform like evidence of a crime, and now the record was closing around him. The vehicle checked out. The travel checked out. The man checked out. All that was left was Mercer's behavior. He didn't handle that well. He hesitated, tried to stay in control of the scene without admitting he had pushed it too far. That only made it worse. By then, the second unit was close, witnesses were already recording, and dispatch had enough information to show that Mercer's original framing was wrong. He couldn't clean it up anymore. Too much had already been captured. When backup arrived, they weren't walking into a dangerous impersonation stop. They were walking into the aftermath of Mercer making a bad call and refusing to let go of it. That changed the atmosphere right away. The focus shifted off Holloway and onto what Mercer had actually done. And that was the real problem now. Not the uniform, not the vehicle. Mercer. He had challenged a lawful military commander without clear legal grounds, escalated the stop after getting no evidence of wrongdoing, and pushed a false suspicion hard enough to call in other deputies. Once that became clear, the encounter stopped being about Mercer's authority and started becoming about Mercer's credibility. That was not a fight he was going to win. The second unit pulled in and saw the problem almost immediately. Not because Mercer explained it well. He hadn't. The problem was the scene itself. A marked government SUV sat at the pump. Colonel David Holloway stood beside it in full command uniform. He wasn't acting evasive. He wasn't moving around. He wasn't doing anything that matched the kind of radio framing Mercer had pushed out. Mercer looked like the only person there trying to turn it into something bigger. That matters. Officers read scenes fast. Good ones do anyway. The arriving deputies looked at Holloway, looked at the vehicle, and then looked at Mercer. By then, dispatch had already confirmed enough to kill the impersonation angle, so the backup officers weren't stepping into uncertainty. They were stepping into Mercer's bad call, while it was still sitting in plain view under the gas station lights. Mercer still tried to hold the scene. He stayed close, kept talking, and acted like he was still running a valid stop. But it was falling apart on him in real time. The core issue was settled. Holloway was legitimate. The travel was legitimate. The vehicle was legitimate. Mercer had started with suspicion, escalated with attitude, and ended up with nothing behind it. Holloway didn't need to do much at that point. He stayed composed and answered what needed answering. He didn't get dramatic, didn't try to embarrass Mercer in front of the other deputies. He kept the focus where it belonged. Mercer had initiated the confrontation over the uniform itself and kept pushing even after facts started cutting against him. That was the whole issue, and by then everybody standing there could see it. The other deputies weren't blind. They could hear the gap between Mercer's earlier radio tone and the reality in front of them. They could also see Holloway's bearing, not just the uniform, the way he spoke, the way he held himself, the way he kept asking for the legal basis instead of getting pulled into Mercer's nonsense. None of that looked like a man pretending to be something he wasn't. Mercer's problem now was simple. He had created a stop that only made sense if his assumption turned out to be right. It didn't. So every extra second he stayed aggressive just made the review worse later. One of the other deputies asked the practical questions: travel status, assignment movement, vehicle confirmation. The answers lined up. Dispatch confirmation lined up. The markings on the SUV lined up. The scene was done. Mercer should have stepped back right there and shut up. He didn't do that cleanly. He tried to linger in that half-defensive, half-authoritative mode officers slip into when they know they've messed up, but still want to look firm in front of coworkers. He acted like he had only been checking things out, just being cautious, just doing his job. That excuse already looked weak, and it got weaker the more people considered how he had actually started. He hadn't approached with neutral caution. He'd gone straight at Holloway over the uniform. He'd demanded proof before explaining any legal reason for the stop. He'd circled the vehicle, trying to manufacture support for his own assumption. Then he'd called backup and leaned into an impersonation theory that official checks did not support. That wasn't caution. That was bad judgment. The witnesses could tell the atmosphere had shifted. The truck driver was still there. The woman recording hadn't left. The cashier inside kept watching because the energy had changed from confrontation to exposure. Mercer wasn't in control anymore. He was standing inside the consequences of his own behavior, and everybody could feel it. Holloway made one thing clear before the scene ended. He stated in a calm and direct way that wearing lawful authority and carrying oneself with discipline should never be treated as suspicious just because an officer decides it doesn't look right on the person wearing it. That was the line that stuck. Not because it was theatrical, because it was accurate. It cut right through everything Mercer had been trying to hide behind. And Mercer knew it. He didn't have a comeback for that. There wasn't one. He had challenged the wrong man for the wrong reason, in the wrong way. And too many people had watched him do it. Once Holloway's status was settled, the rest of the contact had to unwind. Mercer could no longer justify detaining him. He could no longer sell the stop as a developing investigation. He couldn't even rely on confusion, because dispatch records, Bodycam, and witness video had already frozen the sequence in place. That's what ended the scene. Not a threat, not a speech. Documentation. Holloway finished what he had come there to do. Fuel the vehicle. Continue the trip. Mercer was left standing at the gas station with backup officers who now understood they had been called into a stop built on a deputy's ego and assumptions. That alone would have been bad enough, but the real damage started after everyone left. Mercer still had reports to write. Dispatch logs existed. Bodycam existed. Witnesses had video. And now, supervisors would have to look at a stop where a deputy had openly challenged a lawful military commander with no clear legal basis, escalated the encounter after getting no evidence of wrongdoing, and misrepresented the situation over the radio badly enough to bring in another unit. A lot of officers survive messy encounters because the details stay fuzzy. Mercer didn't get that luxury. Too much of this one was captured. By the next day, the footage was already being reviewed from multiple angles. Bodycam showed how Mercer opened the contact. Dispatch audio showed how he framed it. Witness clips showed the tone and pacing from outside law enforcement's own camera angle. And once those pieces got laid side by side, his credibility started collapsing fast. Because now it was impossible to pretend this had been a routine check that just got clarified. It hadn't. He had targeted Holloway first, then tried to justify the targeting after the fact. That distinction was going to cost him. By the next morning, Mercer's problem had moved out of the gas station and into review, That's where bad stops usually get stripped down. No attitude, no adrenaline, no chance to improvise. Just sequence, footage, audio, and policy. And Mercer's sequence was ugly. Sergeant Alicia Bennett started with the body cam. She watched Mercer pull in, step out, and go straight at Colonel David Holloway over the uniform. That point mattered because it killed the idea that this started as some broad safety check or neutral contact. He had focused on the man first and treated the uniform itself like a reason for suspicion. Then she watched him demand identification before giving any clear legal basis for the stop. Then she watched him keep pressing after getting nothing that supported the direction he had chosen. That alone was bad. Then she pulled the dispatch audio. That made it worse. Mercer hadn't just made a poor decision in person. He had sent that poor decision into the system. His backup call leaned into possible military impersonation, even while basic facts were already cutting against that theory. That meant other deputies rolled in with a false impression because Mercer had framed it that way. Supervisors take that seriously. Once an officer starts misrepresenting facts over radio, the problem stops being simple bad judgment and starts becoming a credibility issue. Then the witness videos came in. Then, those clips didn't replace Bodycam. They sharpened it. They showed the pacing from the outside. They showed Mercer circling the government SUV, repeating the same suspicion, and staying locked on Holloway long after a reasonable deputy should have backed off. They also showed something Mercer really didn't need anyone seeing: the contrast. Holloway looked controlled from start to finish. Mercer looked like a man who had made a snap decision and then couldn't let go of it. That pattern carried into Mercer's written report. He tried to smooth the language out. He made the stop sound more neutral than it had been. He used the kind of wording officers use when they know the footage might not help them: concern, verification, suspicious circumstances. The problem for him was simple. Bennett had already watched what happened. She knew where he started, what he emphasized, and how he escalated. His report didn't match his conduct cleanly enough. That's where his credibility really started collapsing. And once a deputy loses credibility with supervisors, things move fast. Bennett compared the report to the Bodycam timeline. She compared it to dispatch. She compared it to the witness footage. The gaps were obvious. Mercer had no documented complaint to work from, no reported crime, no visible evidence of impersonation, no conduct by Holloway that justified treating him like a fraud at the pump. He had acted on suspicion first, then gone looking for support after the fact. That is poison in an internal review. Then command staff got looped in because this wasn't just a sloppy street contact anymore. Mercer had aggressively confronted a legitimate high-ranking military commander in full uniform during official travel, using county authority with no solid legal basis. That carries weight. Agencies hate cases like that because the facts are clean and the optics are worse. The military side confirmed Holloway's status and movement without drama. They didn't need speeches. They didn't need outrage. They just confirmed the obvious and let the county deal with its own deputy. That made the whole thing even more damaging for Mercer. There was no gray area left, no uncertainty, no real factual dispute, just conduct. The review found several problems at once. Mercer initiated the encounter without clear legal justification. He fixated on the uniform itself instead of any actual unlawful behavior. He escalated after failing to find evidence that supported his suspicion. He framed the stop inaccurately when calling for backup. Then he wrote it up in a way that softened what the footage clearly showed. That combination ended him. A deputy can survive one weak call sometimes, even one rude encounter, depending on the agency. But bad initiation, bad escalation, misleading radio framing, and a report that doesn't line up with recorded evidence, that stack usually breaks a career. It broke Mercer's. He was placed under internal investigation first. Then he was pulled from duty. Then the final decision came down. Termination. Badge gone. Career over. Not because somebody yelled louder than him. Not because Holloway threatened a lawsuit on the spot. Because Mercer's own record trapped him. Video, audio, sequence, policy. That's the part people miss when they talk about accountability. They expect one big dramatic moment. Most of the time, it's not that. It's slower and colder. A supervisor watching footage 3 times. A timeline getting written. A report getting compared against audio. An officer realizing too late that every version he offers sounds weaker than the one already on camera. Holloway didn't spend the next week doing interviews or trying to turn himself into the center of a public fight. He continued his duties. He documented what happened. He cooperated where needed. And he let the process do what it was supposed to do. That restraint mattered. It also exposed the biggest difference between the two men. Holloway carried real authority and didn't need to perform it. Mercer had county power, misused it, and then lost it. The second review replaced ego with facts. The gas station incident kept circulating inside the county for a while. Officers talked about it. Staff talked about it. Not because it was complicated, because it was clear. A deputy saw a black man in a command uniform, decided it didn't look right to him, and acted on that feeling like it was enough. Then the cameras showed exactly what that decision looked like in the real world. And that became the lesson. Not every abuse of authority ends with handcuffs or a courtroom. Sometimes it ends with a file, a review, and a deputy cleaning out his locker because he couldn't control his assumptions for 5 minutes at a gas pump. That's what got Ryan Mercer. Not bad luck. Not politics, his own choices. And Colonel David Holloway never had to do anything dramatic to expose that. He just stayed disciplined, asked the right questions, and let Mercer keep talking until the record was complete. That's the whole story. One man relied on ego. The other relied on discipline. Only one of those holds up when the footage starts rolling back. Tell me what you think. Was Mercer just reckless, or did he show exactly who he was the second he walked up to that pump? And if you've ever seen authority abused like this, put it in the comments. Share the story with somebody who gets what real accountability looks like, and subscribe for more stories like this.
Put the phone away, right now.
I'm calling my dad.
No, you don't get on the phone while I'm talking to you.
I'm not doing anything wrong.
Get off the phone now, or this turns into a problem.
This is already a problem. You still haven't told me what crime you think happened. Now, you will deal with U.S. Marshal.
Officer Evan Rourke thought this was going to be one of those easy park stops. A teenager, a backpack, a couple questions, a quick flex of authority. He didn't think it would turn into a multi-angle recording situation with a federal law enforcement supervisor showing up as the kid's father. He didn't think his own body cam and dispatch logs would become the thing that ended his career. Tell me where you're watching from, state or country. And if you like stories where somebody stays calm, asks the right legal questions, and the system gets forced to answer with facts, hit like and subscribe. Here's how it actually started. 16-year-old Jalen Brooks was walking through a public city park in the middle of the day. The place was calm. Families near the playground, a few people on benches, some walkers using the loop path. Nothing chaotic, nothing urgent. Jalen had a backpack on. That was it. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding the bag. He wasn't messing with anyone. He was walking like he belonged there. Because he did. It was a public park. Officer Evan Rourke was patrolling nearby in his cruiser. He saw Jalen and turned in. No radio call came in. No dispatch note about a suspect. No park employee flagged him down. Rourke didn't arrive because of a complaint. He arrived because he decided Jalen didn't fit in his head. Rourke parked and walked straight toward Jalen. He didn't stay back and talk normal. He closed distance and set a controlling tone. The kind of approach that tells a person, without saying it, that they're already being treated like a problem. Rourke started with questioning who Jalen was, what he was doing, why he was there. Jalen didn't get loud. He didn't get sarcastic. He kept his hands where they could be seen and answered in the most controlled way possible. Then he asked the only two questions that mattered. He asked what crime was being investigated. He asked if he was being detained. That's where the stop could have ended. If Rourke had a real reason, he could have stated it. If he didn't, he could have made it a voluntary contact and left. Rourke didn't state a crime. He didn't say Jalen matched a description. He didn't say there was an active investigation in the park. He pivoted into something else. He demanded ID, not once, repeatedly, like repetition would turn it into a legal requirement. Jalen didn't hand it over because Rourke still hadn't explained what crime he was investigating or why Jalen was being stopped. Jalen stayed calm and kept returning to the same point. If this is a detention, say the reason. If it isn't, he should be free to go. That frustrated Rourke, and you could see his strategy shift. He started trying to build suspicion out loud. He treated Jalen's calm as disrespect. He treated the questions as defiance. He started acting like the problem wasn't the lack of a reason, but the fact that Jalen wasn't acting scared. Then Rourke broadened the questioning. He asked where Jalen was coming from, where he was going, why he chose that park, what was in the backpack, who he was meeting. He wasn't tying any of it to a reported crime. He was fishing. He wanted something he could write down later. While this was happening, people nearby started paying attention. One person on a bench lifted a phone and started recording. Another person on the walkway did the same. Someone near the parking lot stopped and held their phone up from farther away. Now there were witnesses and cameras, more than one angle, more than one person. That matters because it changes what an officer can claim later. Rourke noticed the phones. He didn't calm down. He got more controlling. That's when he pushed for a search. He asked for permission to search Jalen's backpack. He didn't say he had probable cause. He didn't say he had a warrant. He didn't point to anything specific Jalen did that suggested a weapon or contraband. He tried to make it sound like an easy way to clear this up. Jalen said no, calmly, no theatrics, no insults, just no consent. Rourke immediately tried to flip that refusal into suspicion. He implied that if Jalen had nothing to hide, he would agree. He leaned on that pressure line because it works on a lot of people, especially kids. Jalen didn't bite. He stayed on the same track. What crime is being investigated, and am I being detained? Then Jalen called his father. He pulled his phone out slowly and clearly in full view. He didn't make any sudden movements. He didn't step toward the bag. He didn't do anything an officer could honestly describe as a threat. He made a normal phone call in a public place. Jalen told his father where he was and that an officer was stopping him and demanding ID and a bag search without stating a reason. Short, clear information. Rourke reacted badly to the call. Not because the call was dangerous, but because the call took control away from him. He stepped closer and told Jalen to get off the phone. He tried to interrupt by talking over Jalen and issuing more commands. He demanded to know who Jalen was calling, even though Jalen was already saying it was his father. He treated the call like it was an act of defiance, instead of a teen asking a parent for help. This is the part people miss when they watch clips like this. The phone call isn't a threat. The phone call is accountability. It means the officer can't control the story alone. The recording phone stayed up. Rourke then called for a second unit. Backup arrived and parked close. Another officer stepped in. Rourke's confidence went up immediately. He started repeating the same demands again. ID and the backpack. But now with another uniform standing there. Like that alone made the stop legitimate. Jalen stayed composed. He didn't start pleading. He didn't start yelling. He stood there with visible hands, kept his voice controlled, and kept asking the same two questions because those questions forced the officer to either explain the legal basis or admit he didn't have one. And at that point, Jalen's father was already on the way. Not as a vague threat, not as a dramatic moment. As a real person driving to a real location because his 16-year-old kid was being boxed in by two officers in a public park while strangers recorded. Jalen's father didn't show up like a guy looking for a fight. He showed up like a professional walking into a situation he already understood. Calm face, controlled pace, eyes scanning everything at once. 2 officers, 1 teenager, 3 or 4 phones held up at different distances. A backpack sitting where it had been the whole time. Deputy U.S. Marshal David Brooks didn't start with insults. He didn't start with a speech. He didn't even start with the as a father angle. He started with procedure. He positioned himself near Jalen without crowding him. Close enough to be support, not close enough to look like he was escalating. Then he looked at Officer Rourke and went straight to the one thing Rourke still hadn't produced: a lawful reason. Brooks asked Rourke what call he was on. Rourke gave a vague answer, the kind that sounds official but doesn't contain any actual information. He tried to frame it as checking things out and making sure and suspicious behavior. Brooks didn't take the bait. He didn't debate whether Jalen looked suspicious. He asked for the dispatch call number or the complaint that led to the stop. Rourke didn't have one. So Brooks narrowed it down again. He asked if a park employee complained, if a citizen flagged him down, if dispatch aired a suspect description, if Rourke observed an actual crime. Rourke tried to keep it broad. He leaned on general talk about thefts in parks, public safety, and people have been reporting things. Nothing concrete, no date, no description, no direction of travel, no clothing description, no victim, no timeline. Brooks watched him do it and didn't let him drift. He asked what specific crime was being investigated right now, in that moment. Rourke still didn't answer cleanly. He pivoted to the backpack. He suggested the bag was the reason. Like a backpack in a park was evidence of something by itself. Brooks immediately cut that off with the obvious point. People carry backpacks in parks every day. If the bag is the reason, then everybody is a suspect. That's not a standard, that's an excuse. Rourke then tried the next move officers use when they don't have a basis. He reframed the situation as the kid's behavior. He focused on Jalen not handing over ID, on Jalen asking questions, on Jalen not consenting to a search. He treated that like it was resisting the investigation. Brooks didn't argue. He asked a simple question that forced Rourke into a corner. Was Jalen legally required to provide ID at that point? And what specific facts created reasonable suspicion for a detention? Rourke didn't like that question because it's the kind of question that gets replayed later on Bodycam, in front of supervisors, in court. Rourke tried to save it by switching explanations. First, it was park issues. Then it was odd behavior. Then it was refusing to cooperate. Each time Brooks pinned him back down to the same point. What started this, and what facts justified keeping a teenager stopped? While this back and forth was happening, the second officer stood nearby and watched. He didn't jump in with a clear explanation either. He mostly backed Rourke's posture by being there. That's what made it feel heavier for Jalen. 2 uniforms creates pressure even when nobody's shouting. The phone stayed up the whole time. And you could tell Rourke knew it because he kept adjusting how he spoke. He started using those careful-sounding phrases that don't actually say anything. He started talking like he was building a report out loud. Brooks didn't let him write the report with his mouth. Brooks asked if Rourke had told Jalen he was detained. Rourke tried to keep it blurry. Not quite yes, not quite no. He wanted the power of a detention without the responsibility of explaining it. Brooks pushed again, because blur is how people get trapped. Was Jalen free to leave? Yes or no? Rourke stalled, and that's when the situation shifted from annoying stop to department problem. Because now the scene had multiple witnesses recording, a teenager who'd been calm the entire time, a father who clearly understood federal standards and documentation, and an officer who still couldn't identify a single specific basis for this encounter. Brooks then did something that made Rourke's face tighten. He identified himself, not as a threat, as context. He didn't flash it around dramatically. He didn't posture. He simply made it clear he wasn't guessing about procedure and he wasn't going to let the stop stay vague. Rourke reacted exactly how officers react when they realize the person in front of them can follow the chain of accountability all the way up. He got defensive. He tried to reassert control with tone instead of facts. Brooks stayed even. He told Rourke to call a supervisor. Rourke hesitated, then acted like that was unnecessary. He tried to keep it in the, "we'll just handle it here" lane. Brooks didn't move off it. Supervisor, now. Because if Rourke truly had a legal basis, a supervisor would confirm it. If he didn't, the stop needed to end before it got worse. Rourke made the call. And while they waited, Rourke tried one more time to pressure Jalen into the easy exit for the officer. Just show ID. Just let us look in the bag. Just make this simple. Brooks didn't allow that pressure to land. He kept Jalen focused on what mattered. Stay calm, hands visible, don't consent to searches, don't provide extra information beyond what's required, and keep everything observable for the cameras. A lot of viewers think the power moment is when someone yells the loudest. It isn't. The power moment is when somebody refuses to let an officer keep the reason fuzzy. And the supervisor was on the way to a scene that was already recorded from the bench, the walkway, and the parking lot. Lieutenant Naomi Vega arrived in her patrol SUV and parked close enough to see the group without walking into the middle of it blind. She stepped out, looked at the spacing, and took a quick read of the scene before anyone spoke to her. 2 officers were standing near Jalen. Jalen was still on the path with his backpack. His father was next to him. Several civilians were holding phones up from different spots. Nobody was rushing. Nobody was yelling. It had the look of a stop that had gone long and attracted attention. Lieutenant Vega walked up and spoke to Officer Evan Rourke first. She didn't open with a general question like, "What's happening?" She asked him to explain why Jalen was being detained. Rourke started talking in broad terms. He referenced recent issues and proactive patrol and suspicious behavior. He didn't give a specific call. He didn't give a specific crime. He talked like the park itself was the reason. Lieutenant Vega cut that down to specifics. She asked for the dispatch information. She asked if there was a complaint from a park worker or a caller. She asked for a suspect description, if one had been broadcast. She asked what exact crime was being investigated at that moment. Rourke couldn't provide a dispatch call number. He didn't name a complainant. He didn't produce a description that matched Jalen. He kept trying to justify the stop with general statements about thefts and safety. Lieutenant Vega then asked what Rourke personally observed that connected Jalen to any specific crime. She asked for actions, not impressions. Rourke tried to make the backpack the thing. He implied the bag created concern and that Jalen's refusal to cooperate made it worse. Lieutenant Vega didn't accept that as a basis. She pointed the conversation back to the standard she needed, a specific crime being investigated and specific facts tying Jalen to it. She also addressed the refusal point directly, refusing consent to a search and asking if you're detained or not crimes, and they don't create reasonable suspicion by themselves. Then she asked the question that forces clarity. Was this a voluntary contact or an actual detention? Rourke hesitated and tried to keep it in the middle. He wanted the authority of a detention without having to justify a detention. He kept talking instead of answering cleanly. Lieutenant Vega pressed for a direct answer and a direct explanation. She gave Rourke another chance to state the legal basis in plain terms. He still couldn't produce one. At that point, Lieutenant Vega took control of the scene in a practical way. She told Officer Rourke to disengage and step back. She directed the second officer to stop crowding Jalen and create space. You could see the posture change immediately because the supervisor's instructions were specific, not optional. Lieutenant Vega then addressed Jalen directly. She told him he was not being detained and that he was free to leave. She made sure it was said clearly in front of the witnesses and cameras, so there was no confusion about whether the stop had ended. Jalen didn't argue. He didn't gloat. He didn't say anything that could be turned into a new issue. He stayed composed, kept his hands visible, and moved with his father away from the officers. Deputy United States Marshal David Brooks didn't try to extend the confrontation either. He stayed focused on documentation. He asked Lieutenant Vega for the procedure to request body camera footage and dispatch records. He asked where to file a formal complaint and who would receive it. He also confirmed the officers' names and badge numbers while everyone was still present. Lieutenant Vega provided the basic information without turning it into a debate in the park. She kept the interaction short and controlled. Then she directed her officers to clear the area. Officer Rourke didn't have a final line. He didn't get to win the moment. He just had to stand there while a supervisor ended the stop and multiple phones kept recording. Jalen and his father left the park. The public part of it was over. Deputy United States Marshal David Brooks didn't treat the park stop like a bad moment that ended when his son got released. He treated it like an evidence event because he'd seen how fast a vague stop turns into a clean report that doesn't match what actually happened. As soon as they got away from the officers, he wrote down the timeline while it was fresh. The time Jalen called him, the time he arrived, the time the second unit showed up, the time Lieutenant Naomi Vega ended the stop. He also noted where each witness was standing, because angles matter when videos start circulating. Within the next day, Brooks started requesting records. He asked for Officer Evan Rourke's body camera footage, the second officer's body camera footage, and the dash camera footage from both patrol cars. He requested the dispatch audio for the entire time window and the CAD entries tied to that park area during that period. He also requested any written bulletin or notice Rourke had referenced about park thefts, along with any call for service or park complaint log that would support the idea that Rourke had been responding to something specific. At the same time, Brooks filed a formal complaint with the department. He didn't write it like an emotional story. He wrote it like an incident report with timestamps. He stated that his 16-year-old son was stopped while walking through a public park, that the officer repeatedly demanded identification without stating a specific crime being investigated, that the officer repeatedly pressed for consent to search a backpack without a warrant or stated probable cause, and that the officer attempted to stop or disrupt Jalen's phone call to a parent. He included the detail that multiple witnesses recorded from different locations and that a supervisor arrived and ended the stop after the officer could not provide a specific basis for detention. When the footage and logs came back, they didn't support Rourke's narrative. The body camera showed Rourke initiating the encounter without referencing a dispatch call or complaint. It showed him escalating when Jalen stayed calm and asked whether he was being detained. It showed repeated ID demands and repeated pressure for a backpack search without a clear stated crime. The second unit arrival added presence, but it didn't add a reason. Dispatch audio and CAD entries made the problem clearer. There was no matching call number that sent Rourke to that park for a specific suspect. There was no complaint logged in that time window describing a teen like Jalen. If there was a park theft bulletin Rourke leaned on verbally, it didn't show up as a real-time directive tied to stopping Jalen, and it wasn't documented in a way that justified detaining a specific person. Rourke's written report then became the focus because it was the only place his justification existed in full. The problem was that his report language didn't line up with what the videos and logs showed. He described the stop like it began with a legitimate investigation and then required escalation. The footage showed the opposite order. He began with a subjective decision, then tried to create justification through questions Idaho demands and pressure for consent. He leaned on vague descriptions and framed Jalen's refusal to consent and refusal to volunteer ID as suspicious behavior, even though those choices were legal and were the same choices many people make when an officer can't explain a detention. With contradictions that obvious, the city had to treat it as a civil rights exposure, not a routine complaint. Brooks retained counsel and the case moved into a civil rights lawsuit based on an unlawful detention and coercive search pressure. The city reviewed the body camera, dash camera, and dispatch records and chose to settle rather than defend the stop in front of a jury with the footage playing. The settlement forced the city to do more than write a check. The department updated training and procedures around park stops and similar discretionary contacts. Officers were required to articulate a specific crime being investigated when detaining someone, document the initiating reason clearly, and follow stricter rules on how consent searches are requested and recorded. Supervisors were also expected to respond faster when a stop extended without a clear basis. Officer Rourke lost his job because the gaps weren't small mistakes. They went to the foundation of lawful policing. Initiating a stop without articulable facts, escalating to pressure compliance, and writing a report that didn't match the record. For Jalen, the result wasn't about winning an argument. It was about getting through a coercive stop without giving the officer an excuse, then watching the system get forced to account for what it did. For Brooks, it was a reminder that accountability isn't a debate in the moment. It's records, logs, footage, and a timeline that doesn't lie. If you've ever been stopped for no clear reason, what would you have done in Jalen's position? And would you have started recording if you were in that park? Share your thoughts. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe.
Where are you coming from tonight? Where are you headed?
Heading home.
You been drinking at all? Anything illegal in the car I need to know about?
No, sir.
All right, then we'll keep it simple. Let me take a quick look in the car and you'll be on your way.
No, I don't consent to a search.
So you telling me you have a problem with me checking?
I'm telling you no.
People who got nothing to hide don't.
The deputy believed he was running the same late-night script he'd run 100 times. A small equipment stop, a few extra questions, a consent search if the driver looked nervous, a little pressure if the driver didn't. He picked the wrong man because the driver didn't panic, didn't argue, and didn't try to talk his way out of anything. He did something that throws off officers who rely on intimidation instead of procedure. He stayed calm, answered what was required, and kept his boundaries clear when the deputy tried to turn a tag-light stop into a fishing trip. That deputy didn't realize he was doing all of it on camera, with dispatch audio running, and with a driver who understood exactly how misconduct gets proven, through timestamps, policy limits, and the officer's own written words. And when the driver finally identified himself as a federal judge, he didn't use it like a threat. He didn't throw status around. He didn't demand special treatment. He stated a fact after the stop had already been stretched past its purpose. The deputy still kept pushing. Right after this hook, tell me where you're watching from. City and state. And if you watch these stories because you're tired of power trips getting excused, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the ones where the record does the talking. Now let's go back to how it actually started, because the most believable part of stories like this is that the first 2 minutes looked normal. It was after midnight on a county highway with long, dark stretches and occasional side roads. Deputy Cole Harkins was patrolling alone. The traffic was light, the night was slow, and his attention was on small violations that could justify a stop. He spotted a sedan ahead with a dim taglight. That was enough. He pulled in behind it and activated his lights. The driver, Malcolm Reed, responded the way officers claim they want drivers to respond. He signaled, slowed, and pulled over smoothly. He chose a safe shoulder. He stopped with plenty of space. He kept his hands visible. Harkins walked up to the driver's side window and started the stop as an equipment violation. Reed gave his license, registration, and insurance quickly. No stalling, no sudden movements, no sarcasm. He acted like a person who just wanted to fix the issue and go home. That's where the stop should have stayed simple. Instead, Harkins shifted away from the taglight and into control. He asked where Reed was coming from. where he was headed, why he was out so late, whether he had been drinking, whether there was anything illegal in the car. The questions didn't match the reason for the stop, and they weren't about writing a citation for an equipment issue. They were about testing the driver. Reed answered the basic questions that actually mattered for the traffic stop and kept the rest limited. He didn't refuse to speak altogether. He didn't challenge the deputy. He kept it polite and short, the way a careful adult does when they don't want their own words turned into inconsistencies. Harkins tried a different angle. He pushed for consent to search. He did it the way officers often do, with soft language that pretends consent is a routine formality. Reed refused, calmly, clearly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult the deputy. He didn't make a speech about rights. That was the moment the deputy took it personally. Harkins didn't accept the answer and move on. He asked again, then again, reworded. He treated the refusal like a problem that needed to be corrected, not a legal decision a driver is allowed to make. Reed didn't change his tone. He stayed cooperative about what the stop actually was. He stayed calm about what he didn't have to do. Harkins's demeanor tightened. His voice got sharper. His body language shifted closer and more rigid. He started framing Reed's calm refusal as if it were disrespect, even though Reed wasn't being disrespectful. Then Reed asked a question that forces an officer to either stay lawful or admit he's drifting. Reed politely asked whether he was being detained for anything beyond the tag light issue. That question didn't come with attitude. It came with clarity. It was the kind of question that makes a stop either end or escalate, depending on the officer's temperament. Harkins escalated. He didn't give a clean answer that matched the facts. He started acting like the question itself was a provocation. He began treating Reed as difficult because Reed was not submitting to an unnecessary search. And then Harkins called for backup. Over the radio, he described Reed in a way that didn't match what was happening. He used the kind of vague language that's meant to justify escalation later. Difficult, suspicious, not cooperating, concerned for safety. It was narrative building. He was setting the table so the next officers arriving would step into his version of events. Here's what Harkins didn't seem to understand in that moment. Dispatch audio locks you into a timeline. If you say a driver is suspicious at minute 3, but the video shows you had no specific reason at minute 3, that mismatch becomes a problem. If you claim escalating concern, but the driver's behavior stays calm and consistent, that becomes a bigger problem. Backup arrived and parked behind Reed. Now there were more lights, more uniforms, more pressure. Reed still stayed composed. He kept his hands visible. He answered what was relevant. He did not consent to a search. Harkins continued stretching the stop. He kept talking around the original reason. He kept trying to manufacture justification. Only after Harkins had already moved the stop into a power struggle did Reed state who he was. Reed explained that he was a federal judge and that he was off duty. He didn't say it like a threat. He didn't demand favors. He said it because the stop had stopped being normal, and he needed the deputy to understand he wasn't dealing with someone who would be intimidated into giving up rights just to make the moment end. Harkins either didn't believe him or decided it didn't matter. His actions showed he was committed to winning the stop. He continued as if the identity was irrelevant. He kept the pressure on. He focused on dominance, not resolution. And this is where the foundation for everything that happened later got poured. Because Harkins wasn't just making choices on the roadside. He was creating a story he planned to put in writing, a report that would reframe calm behavior as suspicious, a report that would label normal questions as resistance, a report that would turn a lawful refusal to consent into a safety concern. Backup arrived behind Harkins a few minutes after the radio call. 2 cruisers on the shoulder for a tag light. Harkins had already told dispatch the driver was difficult and suspicious. So when the second unit showed up, Harkins acted like he needed to justify why he escalated. He walked back to the driver's window and pushed again for consent to search the car. He didn't keep it as a single request. He asked, got a refusal, then asked again in a different way, trying to make refusal sound unreasonable. Reed refused each time. He stayed polite. He stayed calm. He didn't argue. He didn't insult anyone. He simply didn't consent. Harkins treated that refusal like a challenge. His tone got sharper. He started describing Reed's behavior as a problem, even though Reed was still cooperating with the traffic stop itself. Then Harkins ordered Reed to step out of the vehicle. Reed complied. He moved slowly and kept his hands visible. He didn't make sudden reaches. He followed instructions. He stood where Harkins directed him. Harkins kept questioning him about things that had nothing to do with the tag light, where he'd been, where he was going, why he was out late. He repeated the same anything illegal in the car line in different forms. It was clear he was trying to find a reason to keep the stop going or pressure Reed into consent. Reed answered what was necessary and kept the rest short. He asked again whether he was being detained for anything beyond the equipment issue. Harkins didn't give a clear answer tied to a specific crime. He responded with more control language and continued acting like Reed's question itself was suspicious. At this point, Reed stated that he was an off-duty federal judge. He didn't say it like a threat. He didn't demand special treatment. He said it after Harkins had already stretched the stop, as a direct explanation for why Reed was staying careful and asking clear legal questions. Harkins didn't change course. He either didn't believe Reed or decided it didn't matter. He kept the stop on the same track. He continued treating Reed as suspicious based on refusal to consent and normal behavior. Harkins went back to his cruiser and wrote the citation. He took longer than the violation required, and he did not end the stop quickly once he had the documents and the reason for the stop established. He came back, issued the citation, and ended the stop like it was finished and under control. After Reed left, Harkins wrote his report to justify the escalation. He used exaggerated wording to make the extension of the stop sound reasonable. He described normal movements as suspicious. He described Reed's calm questions as resistance. He treated Reed's lawful refusal to consent as a safety concern. He wrote it in a way that made it sound like the situation had been risky from the start, not something he escalated after Reed wouldn't give consent. Reed didn't make a scene that night. He didn't go public. He documented the timeline while it was fresh and began requesting the official records tied to the stop: Bodycam, dashcam, dispatch audio, and the computer-aided dispatch timestamps. Reed requested the records the way a lawyer would, not the way an angry driver would. He didn't ask for favors. He asked for the complete file tied to the stop: Bodycam from Harkins, dashcam from the cruiser, dispatch audio, computer-aided dispatch logs that show when units were assigned, when backup was requested, and when the stop cleared. Those timestamps matter because they don't care about anyone's feelings. The first review didn't happen because Reed went public. It happened because once you request records the right way, the department has to treat it like an official matter. Someone has to pull the footage. Someone has to log it. Someone has to watch it. And the problem showed up fast. Harkins's report described a driver who was difficult and suspicious early in the stop. The video showed a driver who handed over documents, stayed calm, and didn't raise his voice. Harkins's report described escalating concern. The audio showed Harkins escalating after he heard a polite refusal to consent. The timing was worse. The computer-aided dispatch and dashcam time markers showed how long Harkins stayed on that roadside before he even started writing the citation. The report made it sound like suspicion developed naturally and quickly. The logs showed long stretches where Harkins was doing nothing that advanced a taglight citation. He was talking, pressing, repeating questions, waiting, holding time. That matters because the legal limit is simple. A traffic stop can't be prolonged for unrelated investigation without a real reason. not a vibe, not he didn't want to consent, not he asked if he was being detained. The timeline showed the stop got longer because Harkins wanted more than a taglight citation. Dispatch audio created another issue. On the radio, Harkins framed Reed as difficult and suspicious before any concrete event happened that would justify that label. When backup arrived, the scene didn't match what Harkins had sold. No yelling, no threats, no refusal to provide documents, no aggressive movements, just a calm driver standing where he was told. Now, Harkins's report wasn't just off in tone. It was inconsistent with multiple sources that all lined up with each other. Then the review moved from, did this stop get messy, to, did the deputy write something that isn't true? Because the report language wasn't small exaggerations. It was the type of wording departments rely on to justify escalation. Furtive movements, evasive answers, non-compliant behavior, officer safety concerns. Those phrases are supposed to match observable facts. The footage didn't support them. Reed's suspicious movements were slow reaches for documents and normal posture shifts. His evasive answers were short, polite answers to questions that weren't required. His resistance was a lawful refusal to consent and a calm question about detention status. And the judge part, that created a separate track. Once Reed's identity was confirmed through official channels, the department couldn't treat it like a random complaint. Not because he was important, because he was credible, he was careful, and he was clearly documenting. That forces seriousness. So the supervisor had to decide, treat this like a normal stop review or dig deeper and risk finding a bigger problem. Internal Affairs got involved. They compared the report to the footage line by line. They pulled the dispatch log. They looked at when Harkins called for backup and what he said. They looked at whether any actual reason existed to extend the stop beyond writing the citation. And that's when Harkins' story started collapsing in a way that's hard to fix, because you can't argue with time. Harkins tried the usual defense when confronted with this kind of review. He leaned on training and experience. He leaned on "I felt unsafe." He leaned on totality of circumstances. Those phrases work when there's at least something on video to point to. Here, there wasn't. Now, the department had an officer whose written narrative didn't match the recordings. That's not just a bad stop. That's credibility damage. And once credibility becomes the issue, it spreads beyond one incident. Because supervisors start asking an uncomfortable question. If he wrote the stop up this way, how many other stops did he write up the same way? Internal Affairs didn't treat this like a weird stop with a fancy driver. They treated it like a credibility problem. Because once an officer's report doesn't match the video, the department has two options: ignore it and pray it never blows up in court, or dig in and see how deep it goes. They dug. First, they pulled Harkins' history, prior complaints, stops that ran long, situations where drivers said he kept pushing for searches and then wrote them up like they were the issue. Then they opened his old reports, and that's where the pattern started looking obvious. Same wording kept showing up across different stops. It didn't look like fresh observations. It looked like a reusable story template that made every stop sound risky, even when nothing actually happened. IA picked several past incidents where footage still existed and compared it to the narratives. They didn't need 50 examples. A few were enough. The video showed regular drivers doing regular things, asking what they were being stopped for, moving slowly to hand over documents, saying no to a search. The reports described those same moments like the drivers were escalating and the deputy was forced to respond. That's the point where a department stops debating, did he handle it well? And starts asking, can we trust this guy in court? Because court is where this becomes expensive. If a defense attorney can show a jury that an officer inflates facts in reports, every case that officer touches becomes a problem. Prosecutors stop wanting them as witnesses. Judges start questioning their testimony. Cases get challenged. Some get dropped. The county gets nervous. Harkins tried to explain the Reed stop the way officers usually do when video doesn't help them. He leaned on instincts and officer safety. He argued that the refusal and the questions made him unsure about what he was dealing with. He insisted he did what he was trained to do. But none of that fixed the timeline. The logs showed he extended the stop before any real suspicion existed. The radio call happened right after Reed refused consent and asked if he was being detained beyond the traffic issue. The footage didn't show the difficult driver dispatch was warned about. It showed a calm adult holding steady while Harkins kept trying to escalate. The department couldn't frame it as a misunderstanding anymore. Not with the recordings, not with the repeated report language, not with other complaints suddenly making sense in hindsight. So the discipline moved fast once it hit the honesty issue. Harkins was terminated for policy violations, tied to prolonging stops and for writing a narrative that wasn't supported by the evidence. And because truthfulness is the foundation of being an officer witness, it didn't stop at getting fired. The decertification process started too, which meant he wasn't just losing this job. He was losing the easy path to another badge. This is the part people miss. He didn't go down because Reed was a judge. He went down because Reed handled it like a judge. No public scene. No roadside threats. No social media campaign. Reed preserved the facts, pulled the records, and forced the department to look at the stop the way a courtroom would look at it. And that dragged the deputy's whole pattern into the light. After that, the fallout spread beyond one person. Supervisors had to explain why earlier complaints didn't lead to tighter oversight. Training got updated around stop duration and consent search pressure. Internal review protocols changed, so template suspicion language started triggering extra scrutiny. The county also had to brace for defense motions in cases where Harkins had been a key witness, because now his credibility was officially damaged. Reed didn't take a victory lap. He got what he wanted. The record, to be honest,